In the 19th century, folks generally held to the notion that there were 5 kinds of vertebrates, meaning animals with backbones, those being fish, amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals. Then Darwin came along with the idea that some fish had evolved into amphibians, and then some amphibians evolved into reptiles, and then reptiles eventually evolved into either birds or mammals. Other people have suggested something like this since at least Anaximander way back in the 6th century BCE. Aristotle even arranged this kind of hierarchy on his scale of nature, which later became known as the evolutionary ladder. But Darwin was the first to provide working mechanisms for how this happened. That mechanism, and the wealth of corroborating fossils unearthed since then, also overturned the idea of an evolutionary ladder. So our understanding of taxonomy had to change accordingly. To explain, the word fish is colloquial, not a taxonomic term, because the way people used to define what is a fish, being a cold-blooded vertebrate with internal gill bars, scales, and fins, had too many exceptions, too many things that were universally accepted as fish, but that didn't have scales, or that didn't have fins, or that were able to raise their body temperature at least partially, or in the case of the opa, completely, becoming a warm-blooded fish. And then there were fossil forms like Acanthostega and Ichthyostega that were not fish, or not quite fish, being as they walked around on 4 legs, but they still had those internal gill bars. So the old definition of fish really doesn't work anymore. Likewise, if you define a human as having 2 arms and 2 legs with 10 fingers and 10 toes and so on, then what about people with 6 fingers? Some people have 6 fingers. Or if a child is born with no arms and no legs, would they still be human? Not by that old system. But if they were born to human parents, then they must be human children, no matter how different they may appear to be. Thus it was determined that we can't base taxonomy strictly on their current character traits, but on their ancestry. It's the only way to do it. So even though we have ancestors that would have been called fish by the average layman, modern taxonomists would call them instead vertebrates or chordates. Next are amphibians, which used to be classified as vertebrates with semi-permeable skin that also have to lay gelatinous eggs in water. However, the word amphibia has been adapted into taxonomy to refer only to the clade that includes frogs and salamanders and so on, but not also to the fossil ancestors of both modern amphibians and reptiles. So even though proto-tetrapods like Simoriomorpha were apparently amphibian in the original sense, in that they had to start out as aquatic nymphs with external gills and then leave the water and lose their gills to become terrestrial adults, they're amphibian in that sense. And we know that not just because that's the way all modern salamanders are, but because we found so many Simoriomorpha fossils at various stages of development. So we know they're amphibian in that sense, but they don't belong to the amphibian clade that evolved alongside amniotes. So in that sense, amniotes evolved from earlier tetrapods that were very like amphibians, but were technically not amphibians, not true amphibians. The stage between what we used to call amphibians and what we used to call reptiles is called Reptil-o-Mammals, meaning things that look like reptiles or may only superficially look like reptiles, though this is also where they begin to develop keratinized skin and other affectations like scutes or claws, adapting to dry land. One other adaptation to dry land is when amphibians mate, the female releases her eggs and the male is right there on top of her to fertilize those eggs as they are leaving the body. The only way that releasing sperm and eggs together is when they're very close together, and they do it in water because you have to have the moisture. But Reptilia-Morpha get even closer with a probing extension that allows the male to inseminate inside the female, where it is still wet even if the couple are on dry land. So that's how that started. The fossil record is rife with intermediate forms between tetrapods and what we used to call fish, and scientists sometimes refer to these as fishopods. There are also a number of transitional forms like Simoriomorpha between what we used to call amphibians and amniotes, which is a group of reptiliomorphs that includes both mammals and reptiles. And reptiles, too, used to be classified on the characteristics of being cold-blooded, scaly amniotes with claws, until again, we found exceptions to all of that, so that the word reptile is inconsistent as a character-based classification. Now, if we speak of reptiles as a taxonomic clade, we don't call them reptiles anymore, usually don't, for the same reason we don't call them fish either. Instead, we refer to the class Reptilia by the phylogenetically consistent name Sauropsida. It is true that birds evolved from reptiles and are in fact still reptiles today by our expanded understanding. Within Sauropsida are diapsids, classified as originating from a form with two temporal fenestra, meaning holes in the skull behind the eyes. Now, these have fused together in modern birds because of the stress requirements of flight, but we know that their fossil ancestors, like Archaeopteryx, still had them. Within Diapsida is a choice between lepidosaurs with soft leathery eggs or archosaurs with hard brittle eggs. And obviously birds are on the archosaur side of that divide, along with turtles, which are just outside of that group but closely allied with them. Within the archosaur collective is another deep rift between crocodilian forms on one side, and Crocodilomorpha was once a surprisingly diverse grouping, contrasted with more advanced warm-blooded forms like pterosaurs and dinosaurs. If you need to confirm that, I have a 10-part playlist showing all the evidence to prove that birds are definitely dinosaurs. And many dinosaurs had feathers, wishbones, gizzards, four-chambered hearts, and all the stuff that modern birds have. Again, intermediate forms abound between all these groups, especially between dinosaurs and birds. Some dinosaurs had the same types of feathers as modern birds, and some dinosaurs had different types of feathers that no birds ever had. And now let's jump over to mammals. Mammals are not diapsids, they're synapsids, having emerged from a group with only one temporal fenestra. And this is fused in humans and in other primates, but we can still see the remnant of it in the profile of our skull. Synapsids did not evolve from reptiles. They're actually older than reptiles. But if you saw the earliest synapsids, you'd probably call it a reptile. And that's why 19th and even 20th century scientists used to refer to these as mammal-like reptiles. In one sense, we could say that they became increasingly mammal-like until they were actually mammals. But viewing this as a linear progression implies an Aristotelian scala naturae, when what we're really dealing with is a phylogenetic tree of life. So to understand this properly, we're going to have to look not just at the main lineage leading to us, but also at some of the side branches that proliferated for a bit, sometimes extensively, but ultimately eventually faded into extinction. We'll begin with this abbreviated cladogram, because there's actually a whole lot more here and around here than we have time to look at right now. It starts with Morpha, which lived in the late Carboniferous just over 300 million years ago, about 306 million years ago. And this is not just a single species, nor even a genus of species, but a clade of a handful of different taxonomic families. Because if you don't study paleontology, you wouldn't know this, but there are way more life forms known only from fossils than are still alive now. Think about the incredible diversity of life on Earth right now, and realize that all of that represents only about 1% of what can be found in the fossil record. And one amusing way to tell whether an organism counts as a transitional intermediate is when the people studying it can't agree on which side of whatever line it's on. The Morpha are an example of this because it is as yet uncertain whether they are stem amniotes, meaning tetrapods whose young develop in an amnion, or whether they're more primitive than that, being stem tetrapods, meaning vertebrates that are skeletally adapted for life on dry land, typically by having 4 legs. Whichever side of that fence Morpha is on, they're close to it, just barely on one side or the other. Now look at Diadectomorpha, also from the late Carboniferous. Again, it's not just a single species, but a clade of different families. And why are they listed here twice, on both sides of this divergence between synapsids and diapsids? Because again, even the experts can't tell whether diadectomorphs count as amniotes or whether they are only stem amniotes, meaning that they're almost, maybe, but not quite there yet. It's difficult to know whether their eggs were yet enveloped in a membrane or a shell, or whether they still had to be laid in the water, and it's hard to tell whether those eggs yet included amnion. The fossils just don't show us all that. However, it's not like they're either amniotes or they're not, because they have characteristic traits of both, just like you would expect of a transitional form. In any case, they're awkward-looking animals, many with almost no neck, but with oversized hands and forearms like Popeye. The next clade in our list are unambiguously synapsid, and for that reason we'll move to a more detailed cladogram. Caesiosauria is also from the late Carboniferous. Again, there were a whole bunch of these things trying to figure out how to be a land animal. This one looks like a shell-less turtle, and they still have legs like Popeye, and now they have a proper neck, but look at that tiny head. There are a handful of species like this in that group. They would have to be plant eaters, and I guess they would have to be eating plants all the time with such a little mouth. If I was the one to name this animal, I would have called it voodoo-cephalus because of that shrunken head. It reminds me of a scene out of Beetlejuice. The sister clade of Casiosauria is Eupellicosauria, or simply Pelycosaurs. And these begin with the family Varanopidae, still in the late Carboniferous. These were evidently carnivorous, and they looked a bit like lizards. And they even had scales like lizards. But they're not lizards. They're not even reptiles. They're synapsids, like us, but skeletally uniquely different. They just look a bit lizard-like on the outside. On the inside, several features in their skull definitely put them in the synapsid grouping. Kind of like the next family in this tree, Ophiocodontidae. They look a bit like lizards too, only now their heads are too big. These two are from the late Carboniferous because all these groups radiated from a common ancestor that was not long on land before them, being the first tetrapods and then the first reptiliomorphs and then the first amniotes, all within a short period of time after their common ancestor crawled out of the water for good. Like when automobiles or airplanes were first invented, and then soon after there were a bunch of different types of each. The bones of some Ophiocodontids show the first hints of hemothermy. And the reason you shiver when you're cold is because constant muscle spasms generate a bit of heat. If some of these spasms occur internally, like continuously constricting certain blood vessels, that will raise the temperature of the blood itself, which can make the whole animal warmer. And at this stage, they're just starting to do that, and it's not completely efficient yet, nor is it system-wide, so they're a little warmer than they were, but not by much yet, just barely. And this increase in energy expense also means an increase in fuel intake. Where a cold-blooded crocodile, for example, has such a low metabolism that it can go for a month without eating, mammals and their ancestral predecessors have to eat a whole lot more. This also means that they may not have quite as much raw force as a crocodile can produce in any given instant, but they have the endurance to keep going further and faster than a crocodile can. One Ophiocodontid bears another characteristic indicative of things to come. Archaeothyres had a set of fangs. Not fangs like a snake has. These are canine teeth. Differentiated teeth are a mammal trait, whereas reptiles typically have all their teeth looking the same. That's how it is with Adaphosaurus, too. But when we look into the sister group, Sphenacodonts, we see Dimetrodons sporting differentiated teeth. This trend will continue. This is why I wore this shirt for this show, because Godzilla, in his original incarnation, was supposed to be a reptile, vaguely, nobody could tell what type, whether it's the lizard or a dinosaur, no one knows. But the way that they depicted him was that he had differentiated teeth, just like a Dimetrodon. He had all of these little pointed teeth, just like reptiles would have, but two of them were elongated into fangs. Dimetrodon, 2 measures of teeth. That's what that name means. Godzilla also had an external nose, as some of the later animals that we're going to see in this series do. And Godzilla is often depicted in the original incarnation with external ears as well, which is a strictly mammalian trait. Yet this is a reptile. So, interestingly, getting back to the Adaphosaurs and Dimetrodon, those two seem to have developed their sails independently, as not all Adaphosaurs had sails, and most Sphenacodonts didn't have sails. Sails like this have occurred a few times in paleohistory. There were a few dinosaurs with sails like this, and strangely there were some Triassic crocodilomorphs that also have sails too. Once it even happened with an amphibian. But what is amusing to me is that these animals, which developed their sails independently, all lived at the same time in the early Permian period, just less than 300 million years ago. It's as if sailbacks were in fashion back then, just like saber teeth were in fashion among mammals of the Cenozoic. Although the reason for it, at least with Sphenacodonts, appears to be a means of warming the body more. The early Permian was slightly colder than the world is today, and these animals could turn their sails into the morning sun, and veins in their solar-powered sails would heat up the blood flowing through them, and then, of course, that blood, the warmed blood, would warm the rest of the body so that they could move more efficiently, or get an earlier start in the day, kind of like their coffee. And now we get into Therapsids, the next generation, what they used to call mammal-like reptiles. The emergence of this developmental stage is probably best illustrated by Bjarmasuchus, whose shoulders and pelvis show adaptations such that they're starting to walk more like mammals than by reptiles, by positioning their legs beneath them instead of splayed out to the sides. Bjarmasuchans are otherwise a hideous collection of head-banging bogans, aren't they? Therapsids don't all look quite like reptiles anymore. They would be disorienting things to look at if you saw one alive, like a sixth kind of vertebrate that doesn't fit cleanly into any of the previous boxes. And while their teeth and jaws still look reptilian, they have more flexibility. They can even chew a little bit, which actual reptiles cannot do. And now we're moving into the middle Permian with eutherapsids, the more advanced therapsids. This is where we find dinocephalians. These included some of the largest animals of that time. They're also weird because while most other things tend to become more advanced or better adapted over time, practice makes perfect, dinocephalians seem to have reverted to a more primitive state in some respects. They're still quasi-reptilian in their appearance, but they look more like mammals than reptiles, and they really contributed to the biodiversity of the age. The sister clade of dinocephalians are neotherapsids, the new therapsids. One of the traits that you'll note with these is that while most reptiles keep their long, strong, heavy tails, such a large tail comes at a cost when you're warm-blooded. So hemothermic animals reduced the size of the tail. It's a matter of evolutionary economics that the animals themselves didn't even know what they were doing. It's just an eventual aspect of population mechanics and natural selection at work. If we look at the subset Anomodontia, we see another taxonomic family tree, but this one is not just species within families. It's bigger than that, with suborders and infraorders, and one of them are Dicynodonts. Now these are weird. They were plant eaters at a time before the evolution of mammalian molars for grinding fibrous food. So how did they do it? Most other therapsids found a way to make do by chewing with their still pointed teeth, but Dicynodonts only have 2 teeth. Those are their tusks jutting out on either side of a turtle-like beak. Tusks with a beak. That's interesting. And that's how they do it. They dig up the plants with their tusks and chop them up with their beaks. Interestingly, Dicynodonts evidently also had fur. So even as weird as they were, they would have looked more mammalian than reptilian. Now we move on to Theriodontia, named for having more mammal-like teeth. The most famous fossil form at the base of this clade are the Gorgonopsids, the world's first saber-toothed predators. In addition to having fur, Theriodont vertebrae reveal a transition from a serpentine side-to-side motion of reptiles to an undular up and down flexation typical of mammals. They also had mucous membranes and mammalian-type bones with no growth rings, adaptations for hemothermy, and of course some amount of fur, whiskers, and hair, though we don't know how much. In any case, if you saw one of these, you'd be more likely to put it in the mammal box than the reptile box, though we're not quite there yet. One of the defining features of eutheriodonts is the presence of a secondary palate, dividing the mouth from the nasal cavity into 2 separate chambers, and this allows us to breathe while we're eating. Regarding the eutheriodont subset called Theracephalians, it is uncertain at this time whether they are an unimportant side branch or whether they're a paraphyletic group, possibly ancestral to cynodonts, another group known for their canine teeth. And we'll talk more about them in a moment, but I want to acknowledge something else first. If you take the time to explore all of these subclades we just talked about, along with their contemporaries, you'll see that in the middle Permian, there was a profound proliferation. Many different varieties emerged, of all types. They were part of their own ecosystem, like we have today, but where all the parts were played by the wrong actors. They had their own versions of cattle herds, several of them, and of wolves, and they had their own form of gophers or moles, and of hippos, too, a few of them as well, and bison or buffalo, maybe a rhino, not sure with that one. But they had a lot of large lumbering beasts. They even had their own form of elephants, and of course, their own form of lions as well. The middle to late Permian was a whole other world with different plants, different trees, different fish, and way different bugs than we're used to. And their version of crocodiles, or what looked like crocodiles, were actually massive man-eating salamanders. And their version of whales were an inexplicable sort of giant shark. They even had their own form of flying squirrels. Nothing like birds yet, though. Not yet. And at least there weren't any mosquitoes either. They already had some of the same general types of organisms that we still do, but they had a lot that we don't, such that much of that world was bizarrely alien from our perspective. If I could go back in time and visit any period of paleohistory, it would be the Capetanian Age, when the Permian was, I think, at its best. maybe 260 million years ago, no later than that, 261 million years, just to be safe. I think that visiting such a place would be both pristinely beautiful and eerily disorienting at the same time. I should make a video just on that, on what it would be like to go camping and fishing in the Capitanian. After that, however, things started getting bad. Dinocephalians all died out in a mass extinction about 260 million years ago, and the most devastating extinction event ever came just 10 million years after that, wherein 95% of all life was wiped out. Trilobites, eurypterids, and so many other things gone, with no survivors. That was the end of the Paleozoic era, and what followed was the Mesozoic era of the dinosaurs. And while dinosaurs are cool and all, their world was much like our world, except that they're in it instead of us. It wasn't the profoundly distinct, otherworldly scene that so much of the Paleozoic was. Cynodonts emerged just in time for the end Capitanian extinction, and some of their immediate descendants, like Thrinaxodon, persevered through the end Permian extinction, too, otherwise we wouldn't be here. If you look up synapsids on Wikipedia, this is the cladogram you get. However, there are a few cladistic generations and several intermediate forms missing from the end of this sequence, so I'll try to summarize what is going on, but that is not shown here. If you look at the cynodont skeleton, starting with the skull, you'll see that the lower jaw has changed. Earlier forms had the same type of lower jaw as reptiles do, being composed of a few different bones fused together. But in the last few generations we just discussed, the dentary bone has grown larger to take up a higher percentage, while the lesser bones have been diminished and moved further back to the hinge point, leaving cynodonts with a jaw made of just one piece of bone, like we mammals still have today. Those other tiny bones that used to be part of the jaw are now the bones of our inner ear. Another improvement was a bony heel, like mammals have, but cynodonts still had mostly reptilian ribs. The ribs didn't yet connect into a cage like they do on modern mammals. Mammals typically don't have lumbar ribs either, and while cynodonts still did, theirs at least showed some reduction. And once we get into the next descendant clades, the lumbar ribs are reduced so much that they're not really even ribs anymore. This divides the trunk into a thoracic cavity and a diaphragm, which allows for more efficient breathing while running. That's one of the features that allows mammals to run so much further at a time than reptiles typically can. And by the time we get into Probananatha, they already had differentiated cheek teeth. In front of the canines are the cutting teeth, and behind the canines are the processing teeth for chopping, shearing, or grinding. And they're not like reptilian teeth anymore either. They're double-rooted now. And one other important change is the loss of the pineal foramen, a hole in the top of the skull that's also known as a parietal eye. Some cold-blooded animals like lizards and frogs often have a third eye that is hard for us to see. It looks like a single spot or scale right on the top of their head, between and slightly behind the two regular eyes. And this third eye can only tell whether it's light or dark outside, and this ability has been associated with how they warm themselves in the sun. But Probananathans have been warm-blooded and furry for a long time now, so this feature was no longer needed, and it eventually faded away. From Probananathans on, we are well into the Triassic period of the Mesozoic era of the dinosaurs, and the lineage of proto-mammals is trending smaller because, well, it's easier to survive mass extinctions. There have been 2 of them so far, and there's more on the way, and partly because mammals could not compete with dinosaurs. It wasn't just that dinosaurs grew so much bigger than any land mammal ever could. Because dinosaurs oxygenate so much more efficiently than we can, it was worse than that. It was that even in equal sizes, pound for pound, dinosaurs were quicker, stronger, and had longer endurance than either traditional reptiles or mammals. So the best strategy was to stay small enough to hide away, out of the way, going underground and sneaking around only undercover. In previous videos, I mentioned how all the earliest eutherians started out from something that looked like a shrew, and that the earliest metatherians were in the shape of possums, which also looked like shrews. But as we've just seen, their ancient ancestors were wildly diverse, and only a few of them looked anything like a possum. That is until waves of extinction-level events knocked all their populations back, such that the only survivors were the most generalized and therefore the most versatile, adaptable form. Something like small opossums. One of these, Diarthronathus shows us the next important change. Its name means two-joint jaw, meaning that it articulates both from the primitive position between the quadrate and articular bones, and from the new position, being between the dentary and squamosal bones. Descendants of this group didn't keep using both hinges. They went back to only one, but it was the new one, the one that mammals use. Only mammals have dentary squamosal articulation. And finally, as we move into mammalia forms, we have Morganocodon, a taxonomic order of several species representing what could arguably be the first true mammals, even though they're still not technically complete. They're still missing a couple typical traits, but at least they had a rib cage instead of reptiliid ribs. Morganocodons were plentiful, found in Western Europe through Eastern Asia over a temporal span of 40 million years, from the late Triassic to the mid-Jurassic. They found many fossils of Morganocodons at different ages, enough to know that they were diffidont, meaning that these things were born without teeth. And that means they wouldn't have been able to eat for a while as babies, unless they're nursing on mother's milk. That is the defining characteristic of what a mammal is. We're the only animals that have mammary glands. That's why we get our name. But there's one more important adaptation that is exclusively mammalian. When their baby teeth come in, those teeth don't continue to grow with the rest of their bones. Their baby teeth are unrooted and will consequently fall out when they're still very young, to be replaced only once by a permanent set that are already formed inside their jaws. We're the only animals that do that. So, just to recap, the transition from what we used to call reptiles to what we now know as mammals began in the late Carboniferous period and culminated with Morganocodon in the late Triassic, 205 million years ago. So to effectively evolve from lizard-like to protopossum took over 100 million years. But now that you know this much, it will make a lot more sense in the next episode when we talk about evolution within mammals, from Morganocodon to monotremes and other prototherians.